Welcome, and we're going to have a lovely hour or so, I promise you, in talking to Chris Trikilis from St. Stephen's Cathedral in Brisbane. Chris, of course, being their newly appointed Director of Music. And it seems to me there are a couple of aims of these sessions, and particularly the session with Chris today. And one is, I think, that it's very important for us to know as church musicians who are our leaders in church music. And so this is a kind of putting a name to a face, but it's also putting a face to a name. It's also doing those fascinating things of just finding out who this man is, what he thinks, and feeling connected with him, and therefore a little bit more with our own profession. And the second one is that it's always a great chance just to share ideas or to hear ideas about church music. And some of them will be useful and relevant to our own situations. Some of them will not, but of course they're still part of the big picture. So with all of that, can I remind you that we wish you please to keep muted, just because of the audio interference that happens when we're not muted. You could keep your video on, but you could turn it off. That's your choice. You can make comments in the chat room, and we would encourage you near the beginning at least to actually introduce yourself to other people who are here, so that people can actually say, hi, I know, so-and-so was there, or, kind of it's a visual greeting, as it were. But the special introduction is to the man that you might be able to see on your screen, wearing a lovely salmon-coloured jumper by the looks of it. Chris, this is Brisbane, and you're a Melbourne boy. You don't need to wear too many warm making clothes in Brisbane. Chris, nice to have you here, and welcome to Brisbane. Welcome to RSCM Queensland Zoom session. Who are you? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background? What's the journey that's brought you this far?
Thank you, Graham, and good afternoon to you all. What's brought me here? Firstly, to answer the question about my jumper. It's cold here in Brisbane today. It's bucketing down with rain, and it'll be about 16 degrees. So it's cold by local standards. It would have been warm by usual Melbourne winter day standard, but I'm just used to wearing a jumper in winter. So that answers that question. What's brought me here? A few months ago, there was an advertisement saying that there was a cathedral looking for a director of music. And I had been previously at the Basilica in Melbourne, Our Lady of Victory's atop Camberwell Hill. A big, beautiful church built when Melbourne was the capital of Australia. And it was deemed to be the national shrine to Mary, while Melbourne was the capital. And it was intriguing that within, less than 10 years of the building being completed, that the national capital moved to Canberra, and what was left was this enormous domed church just on the eastern outskirts of central Melbourne, which is still there to this day. And I've now arrived here with the quarantine and this whole virus madness, which has consumed most of our world in the last few months. And I have arrived to be doing live broadcasting to an empty building, knowing that it was going out to thousands across the city, the state, and I suppose the world with the way the internet works. And little bit by little bit, as restrictions have eased here in Queensland, we've been lucky enough to have congregations come back initially as small trickles of people coming through. And in the last few weeks, we've been able to have upwards of 100 people coming through, which has been really wonderful to enjoy.
So, just very quickly, having spoken to myself being muted, tell us more about what happened before. So, are you a Melbourne boy? Tell us about mum and dad, siblings, wife, children, pets. Who are you?
All of the above. Yes, born and bred in Melbourne, and cutting my teeth was a wonderful opportunity as the organ scholar at St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne as a teenager. And it was there really that I was able to see music and liturgy really hand in glove, to be able to see what that looks like at the highest level in a main cathedral in a main city in Australia. And that was a wonderful opportunity as a young musician to be able to do that. And I was very fortunate that my parents were happy for my sister and I to have music lessons and to experience as much as we could. And part of that was, well, if I was going to be doing organ studies and other things, this was an opportunity for that. The move up here with my wife and son has not been without its challenges, and leaving family and friends behind, especially with closed borders, and to all of those. And I've seen a few familiar names and faces pop up on the screen in the last couple of minutes from Victoria, and our thoughts are all with you at the minute with the very heavy restrictions. So fingers crossed everything starts returning to normal soon. But no, I think one thing that inspires the next generation of musicians coming through is that opportunity to see it and see it working. And part of the question, I suppose, is what do we do for that next generation to allow young musicians the opportunity to sit at an organ or a piano, or stand in front of a congregation as a cantor or a soloist or as part of a choir, and do things which are well beyond their own means. But conversely, what happens if they do something and it's a total disaster? It's about having those scaffolds in place to build them up, I think, in many ways, to encourage them to have another go and keep doing what they're doing, because that's what inspires good church music elsewhere. If you're inspired as an individual, you will go and inspire others. The question, and Graham, I almost want to throw this question back to you, but I know I shouldn't, is what are we doing in terms of that level of inspiration for our next generation of young musicians? I think RSCM is a very key element of that, but that might be a question a bit further down your list.
I think it is a question further down my list. You've noticed I have a little list. Just before we leave you entirely, it was a Catholic family, or it is a Catholic family, is it?
Yes.
Where does that name come from? I know lots of people called Brown or Campbell or Smith or Jones or even Morton. I don't know any Trikilis ever.
Oh, well, you now know one. That's a start. It's a Greek name. My family have been here now for, I suppose, we'll be the third generation here, having arrived post-war. I have come from a mixed background of Catholic and Orthodox Christian faith, and we've got to experience church in many different forms and guises over the years. And even though I am a Catholic, I see that what we do is crosses a lot of boundaries. I mean, I've been an organist for a period of time in Melbourne, in one of the main Anglican churches there, St Stephen's in Richmond, which has had its wonderful old Walker pipe organ restored, and that's just completely transformed that community with what's happening there. So I think the ecumenism with what we do with church is also a very key thing. I mean, we sing a common repertory across most of the Christian traditions. So
we share a number of singers, as you know, and every so often I ask them what they've been singing down the road at St Stephen's. And I am in full agreement with you. I'm surprised at how much of the repertoire that you guys and we do is absolutely common. Chris, I have a whole pile of questions to ask you, and the next few questions, I want almost one-word answers. This is just a kind of a shotgun through 12 questions. You're going to look back at the recording later and say, bother, why didn't I say such and such an answer? But here goes. Name me a favorite composer.
Buxtehude.
A favorite piece of music?
The Emperor Quartet.
Yeah, that's always a difficult question for a musician, isn't it?
And
of the millions.
Ran through my head there, Graham, but
yeah, that's okay. A favorite organ?
Zagreb Cathedral. It's a wonderful old Volca. The 19th century, sits on the second story of this building dating back to 1094, and boy, does it make a wonderful thunderous sound. There's 4 of those big Volcas left in the world. Zagreb, Riga, Strasbourg, and the last one is in Boston.
I wanted short answers, but in fact, just let's stop that for a minute and just
That's all right.
Briefly tell us, what's your experience of that instrument?
I've been lucky enough to play 2 or maybe 3 times as part of the Zagreb Cathedral's International Series, which they hold on Sunday afternoons throughout their summer. And to get an opportunity to go and sit and play one of the main big cathedral organs in Europe It's an absolute joy, part of my own heritage and discovery through Croatian music literature, especially for the organ, has allowed the works of Franjo Dugan, who was organist interwar between, I was going to say 1908, I think he started, and finished about 40 years later in Zagreb Cathedral, and it completely is the towering figure. And so to play some of his repertoire on the organ that he played was a true honour. I think there was a little bit of a curiosity as to why an Australian was appearing halfway around the world to play the music of the local master. And so they brought the television cameras in from the equivalent of the ABC here in Australia, Hrata in Croatia, and did an interview with me and broadcast my concert, which I had not expected at all. And there was no additional pressure, of course, when they do things like that.
That's right. Yes, exactly. So back to my questions then, and this, you might have answered it.
That's on.
Share, please, a musical experience of terror.
Terror. Coming in on the wrong chord to accompany a bishop who was very, very wayward and kept singing. And I did hope that there was going to be a big hole which opened up in front of the organ console that I could disappear into. I'm still here though, so maybe it wasn't so bad after all.
Names and circumstances not mentioned, I notice. Okay, if you were not a musician, what would you like to be?
Town planner or an architect. I've always had interests in those fields as well as music.
If you were starting again and knew what you now know, what instrument would you like to play?
The oboe.
A favourite choir?
Westminster Cathedral.
Of course. Bravo. You passed. If not here, where would you like to live?
I've always toyed with the idea of living in Europe. That still may happen at some point in the future. But no, Brisbane's a very nice place so far, even with the pandemic having been on.
And the rain.
A little bit of rain's never killed anyone. A lot has, Graham. So
you wait till you see our summer storms. A memorable musical moment.
Memorable musical moment. Can you come back to me on that one?
Yes, so many of them. I know it's hard to choose, but you managed with the composer.
Yes.
What's your favourite key?
Key.
I can come back to
I was going to say G major. It might be A major. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? What's more interesting is how we form these attitudes about favourite keys. I'll let you off the hook, but the next one is an easy one, I'm sure. Who is a significant mentor, someone in music who has or does inspire you?
Dongil Shin, the Korean concert organist, now professor of organ at Yonsei in Seoul. He would be known to Australian audiences. Brilliant player, brilliant teacher, and just an absolute love of what he does. And his enthusiasm rubs off on every organist that he meets. And I think that's a really wonderful thing.
Chris, let's just move on to some more kind of elaborate discussion at the moment. I'm, of course, an Anglican musician, or at least I work for the Anglicans, and it seems to me that Anglican cathedral music and church music generally is highly visible, and maybe Catholic church music, particularly Catholic cathedral kind of level music, is possibly less visible worldwide. I wonder whether you're just happy to spend a few minutes kind of giving us an overview of your view of Catholic music at its brightest and best.
Sure. Graham, I think part of the dilemma especially in our local context in Australia and New Zealand, is that the earliest days of Catholicism in this country was while emancipation was on. So where there was Catholic mass or other opportunities for devotions available, it was very, very limited, or it was still held with that notion of secrecy. If you go to North America, you go to Europe, you see a very different mindset that takes place there. The visibility of Catholic cathedral music, now I'm going to get the date wrong, I think it's 1903, it might have been 1904. There was a motu proprio, which I think has started a vexed question, which we are still dealing with 120 years later, where the Pope at the time said for church choirs around the world, stop singing opera music, because he wanted something which is actually distinctly music for the church. And at that time, they recommended music. They used Palestrina as the model in terms of what could be done in terms of sort of an ideal setting. Now, our dilemma is that right throughout the 20th century, things have changed and changed and changed again. Vatican II is a huge landmark moment in terms of Catholic worship practice. And what that has dealt with and what we now have today is a very, very wide gap between the ideals of the church, which is to promote the patrimony, which is the Gregorian chant, the polyphony, the psalmody and the hymnody, versus what a lot of suburban parishes or things in rural areas where you don't necessarily have the resources of, a qualified musician or a fantastic instrument in the church to really help the worshippers there with what we do in that level of ministry. The cathedral setting is an intriguing one. Our cathedrals are very spread out here in Australia. We are a big population we're a small population on a very big island, and we mostly hug the coast. So, if I use the example of the UK, where the next cathedral is 75 to 100 kilometres down the road, I don't think there'd be terribly many places here in Australia that you'd be lucky enough to be able to get a choir, a cathedral with a choir and a repertoire and everything else with that same level of distance. Our distances between a lot of our capital cities is about 1,000 kilometres. So I think that might have something to do with the visual side of it. So it does exist. It's just a question of being in a place where that is actually available. And that comes with its own pros and cons.
That whole issue of parish music and regional areas and so on is a very interesting one, and it would be at the heart of the musical experience of many of the people, perhaps most of the people who are listening to us today. And it was interesting because I was reading an article, I think just this week, which was about the history of West Gallery music in Australia. Because again, the same was true in England. Local churches weren't singing William Byrd and they weren't singing Thomas Tallis. They had the local musicians who probably were playing the fiddle in the pub the night before in the West Gallery of the village church and making music there. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about the practical level then of how you see, or what you see as the potential, if it is or is not being realised, of parish Catholic music in Australia?
Sure. I think you're right that where our population is a little bit thinner on the ground and not having those qualified musicians able to just be available at a moment's notice for things, you have to wear multiple hats. And the question is, well, are you playing the church music on a Sunday because you love the church music and you've been asked to play the pub the night before, or is it the other way around? And how does that influence your choices? How does that influence what you're actually doing? One of the fascinating things that in the Catholic realm has never occurred in Australia, but I would say has probably been a little bit more successful in the Protestant streams, especially with something like the Australian Hymn Book, and then Together in Song, which is its replacement, is that the Catholics have never had a national hymnal. And this is something that is quite, it's something which, if you look at other countries around the world, there is a common core repertory of music that it doesn't matter where you are in that country, the chances are you're likely to know the same music, even if it's not necessarily performed to the same standard. You can't expect, a hymn to be played on, a big grand cathedral organ in the same way that, a church has got a little dusty harmonium sitting at the back or on the side, or a little spinet organ or something else is going to have that same impact. But we're all there doing the same thing. The national hymnal question, I think they tried to work out what they could do in the Australian context with Catholic Worship Book 2, which is a very vexed and contentious book in some ways. Catholic Worship Book 2 was a number of years overdue. The initial Catholic Worship Book was actually launched 2 days before I was born, and so for those that already are aware of that, you now know how old I am. But Catholic Worship Book 2 has tried to provide everyone across Australia a standard repertoire. And it's to draw a line in the sand and say, if we as a worshipping community, or let's say you're on holidays or you move interstate or something else, you don't feel that you go to another church and it's actually unfamiliar to you. It's the difference between capital letter C and small letter c, which I'm sure our audience will understand or differentiate between the two. Catholic Worship Book 2 is not perfect, and I wouldn't be the first person to ever say that any hymn book is not perfect. I don't believe there's ever been a perfect hymnal. But it's provided a very interesting snapshot of what music should look like across all of our Catholic institutions, whether it's parishes, cathedrals, schools, hospitals, universities, where you would be requiring music in liturgy. And the book tries to actually provide a snapshot of the entire church year. And for some people, exploring what is in that book for their first time in their lives is actually rather daunting, because there's a disconnect between what they have been doing previously and what they are now actually expected to use. But the dilemma has been that those books have not actually gone into every church yet across the country. The book's been launched for 4 years. And what it's actually doing is creating that gulf which may have existed before, and it's actually making it even more broad by not having everyone to allow that same access to that. Can I just add a disclaimer here that book is supposed to run alongside the new Roman Missal, which has been around for about 8 or 9 years. And so if the two are supposed to work hand in glove across Catholic churches in Australia, I would be assuming that it should have been something that every parish was aiming to work towards. A lot of it in there is not, it's user-friendly. It's not actually that it's going to be beyond most of the church musicians out there, whether they are qualified organists with lots of letters after their names, or someone who just happily sits at a piano and belts out a few hymns every now and then when they go and volunteer once a month at their church, or even for some of them, whether it's there on a guitar. I mean, that's also a very vexed question. I'm not sure RSCM, that could be another question a bit further down the list.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I don't know whether you're aware, but perhaps 20 years ago now, maybe longer, I don't know, Richard Prue in America had a fabulous series that were published by GIA, and I'm talking about choir music now, but a series of historical anthems, motets, and so on, that were published in a series, and then also wonderful recordings with very, very fine choirs singing them, but really, really simple music. And it always intrigued me that kind of approach to Catholic parish music never ever seemed to have any hold in Australia at all. Is that, do you think, because you want to comment on that? Is it because we didn't think it was culturally relevant, or is it because we just Catholic musicians don't communicate well, or is it inappropriate? What do you think?
The beauty of the North American scene, I think, is music scene for churches is also its downfall, and that's that they have very, very large population numbers. And part of what they continue to do is produce new books of music on an almost yearly basis. I wonder, with a smaller population here in Australia, whether our dilemma is in fact that we're not used to having an appetite for such new music to be coming through continually. And if you don't know what you're looking for when a list of, let's say, 12 new books or 12 releases of something has been released, which one do I actually go and have a look at, because I don't recognise any of those names. Richard Prue, I actually met when he was here in Australia. I was going to say it was either 1998 or 1999, and I found him to be an absolutely wonderful musician, and to have gone also to where he was for years at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago and see just a spectacular music program in place that was there. That's the sort of thing which the accessibility to the average church musician, if you don't know what you're looking for, and then can I ask perhaps in a different way, what are we doing if you would be encouraged to do that by looking at a magazine or a recommendation from someone or somewhere? Where do we publish those in terms of church music in Australia to encourage what would work in the local context?
I wonder whether part of that, and I'm asking, I'm not really wondering because I'm the outsider here, but I wonder whether part of that comes to the musical training and background of Catholic parish church musicians, and no criticism is implied by that at all, but in fact that links to the questions of structure, that is where you have teams of people who are leading music, just because the Catholic Church has so many more masses than, say, the Anglicans do, if only because you have much larger congregations. I mean, is that part of it? Does this kind of speak to the leadership that happens or is able to happen in a Catholic parish, do you think?
There's an element to that. Part of the dilemma is that after Vatican II, people were encouraged to sing at Mass. And that was often what they called the hymn sandwich, which I know is also common in a lot of the other denominations, where you would have hymns interspersed with the rest of the Mass, which was spoken at the time. And in the course of 50 years, it's all been turned on its head in some ways, where there's been a realisation in the Catholic spheres that it would be better to be singing the Mass rather than singing at Mass. So it's learning, congregational responses and those sort of things. That's actually a lot harder for a volunteer musician or someone who's part of a team to work out, well, what do we do here? Parishes that, or the beauty of cathedrals, I suppose, and the larger parishes is that they often have a coordinator or a focus point for where the actual musical choices or standards come from. And when you've got a group who may only play once a month, they may only have a repertoire of 12 or 14 hymns. And that may not necessarily gel with the readings of the day from the lectionary or what's happening there. Or you might show up at church the next week and you've heard something completely different to what you've heard the week before. That notion of continuity, actually having the qualified musicians in place, has been asked at a number of levels. I think it's also been compounded in Australia by the fact that we don't have anymore a church music degree available through ACU. That was the place that a Catholic musician was able to actually get training in Christian worship, but at a very specific level within the Catholic ethos and mindset. I look at universities in the States and in France and in Germany where they have a very different mindset with that training is seen as the first and foremost, and then they say, well, you've now got this training, go out into the churches and make good on what you've learned.
That's right, and even in Lutheran circles, you don't get employed unless you actually have training of a certain level, or at least, to go back, your level of remuneration depends on the level of training that you actually have in this kind of professional structure. Chris, you said right near the beginning in my short rapid fire questions, you said that Westminster Cathedral was a favourite choir. Can you talk briefly about how the differences between Westminster Cathedral and St. Stephen's Cathedral in Brisbane? And I don't mean in terms of resources. Clearly they're fabulously resourced and they have a tradition and they have a standard. I guess what I'm really asking is, should the Catholic Church, more than most churches, kind of has a reasonable claim at being a universal church. Is there then unity in approach and philosophy and etc. between an Australian cathedral and a overseas cathedral? Or should a Catholic cathedral in Australia in some way be distinctively Australian? And if so, and I don't know, nothing's implied by the question, but if it were to be the case, in what ways might it be?
The cathedrals that put resources into music are ones that believe that by upholding what they see as the music tradition, they are leading people, whether they are worshippers, visitors to the place, anything else, to greater and higher things, which I think is common across all church realm and mindset. In the Catholic system, Westminster Cathedral is really held as one of the key, in the English-speaking world anyway, in terms of the quality of music, but it's also music tied in with liturgy and a whole range of other things that take place. Westminster, I think, was in a very unique position. If you look at all the main church buildings in London, they're all built in a Gothic style. So to create that level of something a little bit different, being a Catholic cathedral, it's a huge Romanesque building, which has a very, very different impact and feel than sitting in a Gothic church. The quality of the choral music and their just everything that you go and see is really first rate. They've really paid a lot of attention to what happens on that context. The closest I think we would have to the Westminster approach in Australia would be St Mary's, Sydney. Now, St Mary's, it was founded as a normal cathedral choir once they built a cathedral and everything else, but it was only in recent years that Thomas Wilson, who was at Westminster, was encouraged to bring elements of that model to Australia. And with that has come a big level of professionalism. And I think that's probably a side discussion along with everything else that needs to happen. Can I now take things to the Brisbane context? This year, the Brisbane Cathedral celebrates, or the Archdiocese celebrates 50 years since the reforming of a cathedral choir up here. It's quite an exciting time, and we've got some plans in November to be holding a special concert for that. Hopefully the pandemic is all over, that we can have an audience or congregation to sit and enjoy the music live. The context that matches the location, I think, has a big impact. Life in Brisbane feels very different to life in Sydney, different to Melbourne, different to Hobart, different to Adelaide, different to, name a town or city in this country or even overseas. And I think part of it is just the way that particular city or that location ticks. Every director who comes in might have their own specific favourites in terms of musical styles or favourite composers and those sort of things. But the aim should always be for the quality of music. And if you've got the quality there, I think the exploration is limitless. The question is, what is the starting point to encourage?
Is it fair to ask you then, what are your aims for Brisbane? Without kind of knowing that it's early days and without kind of exposing yourself too much to the danger of setting up parameters that you might or might not be able to achieve? Sure.
I've arrived and there were no choirs. I make a very bold statement with that. The pandemic allowed a very bizarre starting point for me. And that was that where the normal pattern of musical life within the church year didn't exist. And we were broadcasting with an organist, a cantor, a bishop or a priest, occasionally a deacon, and a reader. That was the 5 maximum capacity in the building. So that notion of what the style and standards of music could be, were that we had to do with what limited resources were available. And I think that's also part of the challenge for church music in the future in Australia. I don't know whether all the churches that are out there today will still be there in 10 or 20 years. And the question is then what happens to those musicians, or if we don't have positions to encourage another generation to come through. Let me come back to your question about what my plans are for here. So far, I've been thrilled with what I would call the infrastructure. There are a lot of sound things which are in place. There are 2 choirs here, the Cathedral Choir, which is boys and men, and there's a few ladies singing in the alto line currently, not dissimilar to what you have up the road at St John's. There is a pipe organ in the cathedral, which is about to get a new lease on life, I hope, with some urgent repairs. Hopefully I haven't said too much, but watch this space for those that are the organ aficionados across the country. We have a choir room, we have a library with mass settings from, I think the earliest ones would be Hassler, through to some recent compositions by two local Brisbane composers. So these would all be within the last 5 to 10 years. So it's a matter of saying, well, we've got this as our resources and that is our start. The uniqueness of St. Stephen's, I've been reminded by a number of people, is that there is no inner city church here in Brisbane for Catholics. So the cathedral has to play multiple roles. It's not just a cathedral, but it also needs to be there as the inner city church for people to be able to come in and treat it as their normal sort of parish fare. And if that's the case, what speaks to them as well as what people are looking for which you might call the more traditional elements of church music with robed choirs and those sort of things. I will wait and see what happens in the coming weeks and months, but I'm still getting a feel of how this city works and what the requirements really are in terms of church music here. But coming back to my comment before about the Catholic worship book, the dilemma I think that will be faced for me is actually that there's not a common starting point here. Well, not that I've been able to identify yet. Maybe it is there and it's right in front of my eyes and I haven't seen it. But in a lot of ways that would be a little bit more obvious in other cities in Australia.
You were talking before, you've spoken several times about encouraging young and the new generation, and you obviously have a very strong sense that the future of church music does exist with our ability to foster people into the fold of being church musicians, something that in Brisbane we really struggle with. And I think my observation is that perhaps Sydney does this far better, at least in terms of young organists, than does Brisbane. I'm not sure perhaps about Melbourne. But do you want to talk a little bit about the future of organ playing, given that it is so parlous in Brisbane? And it does seem to me it's a little bit like a chicken and an egg. That is, a traditional liturgy, many would say, needs an organ. So without the organ, you have poor liturgy. But then if you have poor liturgy, you don't need the organ, and the spiral continues downwards. So what would you like to say about young musicians, and particularly young organists, and maybe for that matter, young choir trainers?
If the starting point is that people will continue to learn the organ, the question is and this almost open up to the floor of anyone who is listening today, what is it that inspired you with church music or hearing the organ or something else? I think our biggest change has been that we don't hear the organ in the frequency that perhaps previous generations have. And you've often got to be in a place where the organ is treated as front and centre, that you might get that regularity or the inspiration to hear what it can do. A young person today may be lucky enough to hear a live organ 3 or 4 times before they've graduated from school, which is a vastly different contrast to a couple of generations ago, where there would have been civic events in town halls or city halls, regular church service. I mean, even just general community singing has changed in recent years as well. Chicken and egg. Graham, you've asked the difficult question there. Is it better to have the inspiring musicians and not have an instrument for them to demonstrate their skills, or is it better to have the instruments and let them sit there and not be used? There will be times that you'll actually get the right musician with the right instrument, and if someone hears that and they get inspired by it, I think we actually need to encourage it as much as possible. The reason we have organs in churches is that they make their sound in the way that the human voice does. There's no other instrument which encourages congregational singing as well as the pipe organ. And it's amazing when, even with the sort of the contemporary music scene at the minute, where you'll have a sort of the keyboard plugged in as a soft piano sound and a few other sort of effects behind it, that doesn't hold the congregational sound in the same way that an organ does. And there have been some intriguing studies of late that have shown that actually, if there's a way to incorporate the organ in with congregational singing, even if there are with these other instruments, with the variety of musical styles out there, it seems to have a very different impact. People suddenly actually have a different appreciation of what the organ is and what it does. We should have another generation or two coming through, but as we know, across Australia, there are fewer and fewer students learning musical instruments through their schooling years. And I think that's actually something which runs parallel to the decline of the next generation of musicians coming through into our churches, is that if they haven't had that basic standing first, whether it's something as simple as just having, a school music teacher coming into a primary school a couple of times a week, that has completely transformed the last 20 years. I've come from a state where it's an option in primary schools. There's no compulsory music education in primary levels.
I think that's a very interesting point, and it's a point that has some is pertinent for the Queensland situation. A lot of people who live in Queensland lament dramatically our music education, but a lot of people from interstate look over the border and envy the fact that at least in the state system, any child who wants to learn an instrument gets given an instrument and gets free access to group lessons once they've passed the most elementary of kind of audition processes. That sounds like it's a really good thing, but in fact, the problem with it for church music, well, at least for organ playing, is that keyboard is excluded from that. These are stringed instruments, these are band instruments, they're orchestral instruments at best. When I used to go and teach, a week in Singapore each year, and it would be really interesting because you'd be standing in front of 60 grade 10 students in Singapore, and there would be literally one violin player, one flute player, and every other student in the room played piano, and in fact did exams in it. And in Queensland, at least, we have lots of people playing instruments, but they are instruments that are not keyboard and therefore don't lead to organ. There's lots of work for RSCM, but for every individual church and for every parish and every organ player to do, I think, in this area. And it's not one we're going to win this afternoon, I'm sure. Moving on then a little bit, and I'm sorry that we're because we only have an hour, we're kind of making you be the guru in everything today. But one of the other ironies that I think is that we're also in a society where people have far more access to far more music than they've ever had before. And yet I would argue that the musical literacy of the community is exceptionally low. And I think the example that I've shared before is that the Tovey books of musical analysis, which sit in the University of Queensland Music Library, which one would hope that the best of our students are studying, were actually written for the general populace to read the analyses of Bach, Brandenburg Concerti and the rest of it. And so I wonder then, do you have a sense of what the church musician's role is outside of the walls of their own church, parish, cathedral, synagogue, whatever? Do we have a community role? And if so, how might that be played out?
The common word, and you asked me for a series of one-word answers before to that question there, Graham, is education. And I actually wonder whether as church musicians, and it doesn't matter at which level of church music you are at, whether you're at, a big cathedral or, a humble, church somewhere else, I think the question is, what do we do in terms of continual education? Because if we are not inspired as musicians, how can we be expected to go and inspire others? Do we have the flexibility or the options presented to all of our musicians across any denomination to go and have continual lessons in, whether it's, further keyboard skills or, I've played the organ for a number of years, but I'm now playing a contemporary service. What do I do when I need to suddenly go and sit across at the piano and bring those skills over? Or, in the Catholic realm, I've sat there and wondered, well, what are we doing in terms of cantor training, which the cantor role, which in recent decades is supposed to be that intermediary between the solo voice and also the voice to lead that congregation in their singing. What are we doing to actually train that next level of cantors so they actually know why they're doing what they're doing, but also to be able to do it as well as they can, or to perhaps learn some tips from someone else who might have tried that way before and come up with a different answer or a different conclusion. This is not something which will be easily answered overnight, and I don't know whether it's an individual denomination needs to look at each cohort, whether it's in their diocese or their presbytery or however they're structured, or whether it's actually something which we need to look at a more holistic level. And the question, of course, is resourcing. Where do we have access to a number of practice instruments or a venue where we can hold certain days like this? Where are these presenters coming from? Are they able to actually enhance what's going on? Can I take it to a Catholic suburban parish context for a moment? If you've got 5 or 6 different musical groups, can you send all 6 groups on the same day to a sort of music mentor, for lack of a better phrase, to come in and make some suggestions as to what they're doing, and also to try some other techniques or different things to improve what's happening. RSCM has played a wonderful role in Australia over the years. But like with so many other community-based organisations, I think it's going to face a rethink in terms of what are we doing to be able to provide that education or those tools to our members to encourage them to keep going out and doing what they do. Because if they're doing good things, they will inspire their congregations. And I think it's from that point that you'll find the next generation of musicians, even if they've only had basic training, encourage them to come through. But then at the other end of the spectrum, are we still providing choral scholarships, organ scholarships in our big churches and our cathedrals to encourage these young musicians at the what we would deem the highest level of music making?
Boy, there is a month of discussion that comes out of that. Many of us participated a few weeks ago in a conversation with Peter Catt from St. John's Cathedral, and he was talking, when we were talking about clergy training, he saw the biggest dilemma is the lack of time, the time pressure that's on our people who are training for the priesthood. And I think one of the dilemmas in much of what you're saying is, in fact, people's lack of time. I love the mentor notion that you actually shared. And I've always been impressed at the RSCM, I'm talking now about the RSCM in England, that it's been able to choose as its directors. It's been able to find people like the Andrew Reeds of the world, and indeed its founder, Sir Sidney Nicholson, because you need to be a particular sort of musician to leave your cathedral or doing what you know intimately and love in order to become a trainer to help other people and miss out on that maybe even self-indulgent experience yourself. And I've always thought that in Australia, that's part of the problem. The people who can help us, the people who can help train and advise our cantors are themselves being cantors at exactly the same time that they could be helping and assisting other people. And there are kind of lots of dilemmas there. Chris, we've got a few minutes left. We've got some time left. There are interesting and creative models of the way church music might evolve, and you spoke a moment ago about RSCM addressing some of this. People who share the kind of Facebook feeds I'm sharing have, of course, been seen as Facebook feeds dominated this week by the news that Sheffield Anglican Cathedral is shutting down its choir. And whether that's a positive thing because what is resurrected is bigger and better, or whether this is all a smokescreen for, in fact, taking music and worship in an entirely different direction, nobody knows. And we know that Liverpool Catholic Cathedral in England has, again, a really creative approach to keeping liturgy alive and involving young people. That is a new model. Do you have any models that you either have in your head that you've seen in other places or borrowed from other places, or you would like to encourage people to consider that might move church music into a future that is flourishing and alive?
Sure. In the Catholic context, and sorry to drag things back to that, but I think this has been an interesting starting point for our conversation. There has been something called the Youth Mass for a number of decades, which sort of started up in I would say the 70s, before I was born. I'll put a disclaimer on that. And this notion of young people coming together to make music and join together in worship and fellowship and all of those sort of things. The dilemma is that for most of the people now attending a youth mass, they are no longer the youth, and they are seeing a small group of youth coming through and then complaining that, oh, you're not doing the music of my youth, or those questions. I think, you know, it's not necessarily, to make multi-generational church, you shouldn't be looking at something which speaks to one generation or one particular group over anyone else. And I wonder whether that's actually been part of the downfall with encouraging the different creativity options within worship. Can I then juxtapose that with something completely in contrast? Last year, I went to the American Guild of Organists in Denver, which was a regional convention. So not their ones where you have 3,000 or 4,000 organists from around the world coming together for a week of non-stop workshops and concerts and meeting up with other church musicians who are doing exactly the same thing that you are. It's just that 1 week in the year where you actually get to see everyone else at the same time, all enjoying the same things that you do. And I wonder whether we actually need to be holding something on those lines here in Australia in the years to come. But one of the workshop afternoons was to go to the Anglican Cathedral, where they offered a contemporary worship service, where they had written or rewritten about half of the service. So they'd taken away the traditional forms on most of the fronts that we would normally identify. We're up to X, Y, Z, you know, in the prayer book for where we're up to for worship this Sunday. What they tried to do was to provide a new model, a new level of creativity that came through. They actually employed a professional jazz band to come in. There were 5 professional musicians. Interestingly enough, the congregational singing were all traditional hymns played with this jazz band, who tried to play them as we would normally want to have them sung and performed. That, which to me was a complete revelation. Yet in the middle of this service, there was about 7 to 10 minutes worth of what I would call exploration, where you were encouraged after a very, very short sermon, and this will get me in trouble with some of the clergy, but it was easy to say, okay, we've now had a 3-minute sermon. We want you to go and somewhere else, go and explore part of this cathedral you've never seen before, and come back and light a candle before you sit down in your seat before we continue. They actually changed what church looked like in terms of its form. And my question, which I never got an answer for, was, well, has that attracted different people in? If this is the way that, you know, they're exploring a different form of worship, is this actually a way that's going to be drawing more people in than, say, the traditional forms of worship that a lot of us are used to? I think the other question is that, do we have uniformity with when you go to church? I'll use the example of the state of Queensland. There's 5 million of us living on this side of the border. Do you get the same order of service, the same level of expectation when you go to church, whether you are in, you know, the inner city, or you're in one of the outer suburbs, or you're in a town 900 k's north of Brisbane? These are the questions that I wonder. Have we got the same levels of expectation all the way through? And that has a huge impact on what we do musically. And I think the answer to that needs to be that we look about quality rather than quantity with things. Do we actually need to ensure that what we're doing is as good as we are doing? And if so, how do we either make that better or maintain those standards?
Chris, this has been a fabulous discussion, and thank you very much for being part of it and being happy to kind of put yourself on the mat there and have me fire questions at you. What I've also enjoyed is that, in fact, lots of your answers have just kept on raising more questions still. And so there could be a whole conference and more coming just out of the discussion this afternoon. Can I encourage all the people who are listening to realize that Chris is a really nice guy, and if you want to be in touch with him at some stage because you'd like to share thoughts or because you'd like his thoughts, I'm sure he would welcome that contact. And I speak especially, says he, as an Anglican, but inviting our Catholic friends to see Chris as someone who is a peer, a contemporary, and a fellow traveller in this road of church music together.